Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. I was actually a part of the last round of the mentorship program, and it was a really rewarding experience, and definitely recommend it. My mentee is now working in the Bay Area, so I don't see him as much as I used to, but highly recommend joining that if you're interested. So I'm here to talk to you today about visualization with Observable and Friends. So if you're really excited about the narrative part of this talk, I'm sorry. I submitted the title a really long time ago, and it turned out that this is, I think, a slightly more apt presentation for the audience. So if you were excited about the narrative part, I recommend go read this book called Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaum. Really good. Covers it much better than I would have, so you're really not missing out. That said, who am I, and why are you listening to me anyways? So, like I said, I come from a software engineering background. After I graduated with my CS degree, I worked for Zynga, making a game that was kind of like a cross between Farmville and The Sims, which briefly had millions of users before cratering completely. And after that, I went to Google, where I spent a little longer. Stayed there for 4.5 years. And while I was there, I mostly worked on data visualizations and tools for making data visualizations for advertisers. So if you ever use AdWords, or I should say the newer interface to AdWords, then you probably touched or like fiddled with the knobs on some of the graphs that I worked on. So after 4.5 years of that, I realized the part that I really liked was doing that data visualization work. And I decided to kind of strike out on my own, and I spent the last 6 months or so doing full-time consulting work around data cleaning, data gathering, data visualization. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about a few different things. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about process, very briefly, and kind of one way that I think about data visualization work. Then I'm going to talk about observable notebooks, which are a really great tool for anyone doing anything with JavaScript, but maybe especially for visualization type work. And finally, I'm going to talk about this little library that I wrote that makes it easier to publish the work that you might make on Observable. So data visualization, like pretty much any kind of software development, is a very iterative process. You really want to approach it from multiple angles, take lots of revisions. You know, you're going to slowly polish this thing over time, like you would with any piece of software. And one way I think about this is that a lot of data visualization work can kind of be thought of on a spectrum from exploring the data to explaining the data on the other side. And even if you want to end up explaining, you want to start by exploring, right? And I think oftentimes people don't do enough of the exploring part. And what I mean when I say exploring is you come up with hypotheses about the data you have, and then you validate them or you bust them, and then you come up with new hypotheses, and you just do that over and over again. And after doing some rounds of this, you're going to have a much better understanding of what it is you have before you try to explain to other people what you think you have. It also avoids some really awkward moments where, like, maybe it turns out that the visualization isn't quite accurate. And so I think that iterative process is really important from getting across that explore spectrum. But also when you're actually creating that final graphic or whatever it is, you also want to have that same kind of iterative process of polish to create a really great result. So one of the tools that I think is really great for doing that kind of iterative work is Observable Notebooks. So quick show of hands, who here has heard of Observable Notebooks before? Awesome. Okay, good. That means that this isn't going to be too boring for everyone then. Okay, how about this? Who's heard of R notebooks or Python notebooks before? Okay, good. So observable notebooks are a similar idea. They're an environment that you write code in, but this time it's for JavaScript. And Observable has some key differences from the other kinds of notebooks you might be familiar with. So there are a lot of things called observable in the world of software engineering. Specifically, I'm talking about observable notebooks. They all live on this website, observablehq.com. You should definitely go there after this talk and check it out. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. So Observable is the current project of Mike Bostock, who is the creator of D3, which you may be familiar with. One of the other core team members, they have 3 engineers on their team. One of the other core team members is Jeremy Ashkenas, who created Backbone. So they have some really smart folks behind it. It's definitely worth checking out. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you a little bit of what it looks like. So if I can, yeah, okay. Maybe I can get out of full screen here. Okay. All right, so this is the homepage of Observable, and you can see there's like the normal kind of social website stuff, right? They have this collection of notebooks where if you're interested in actually learning about this after this, start in this introduction section. There's like way more detailed descriptions of everything I'm gonna explain. Because this is a short talk, this is gonna be like a really whirlwind tour, so prepare yourself. So then, so these are collections of things, but then they also have like just what's been popular this week. So lots of cool things. But I'm gonna show you this notebook that I made specifically to introduce you all to notebooks. And this is gonna be a little tricky because I wasn't expecting to hold a mic, so we'll see how well I can type. So this is an observable notebook. You can see it's made up of cells. So this is a cell, next cell, next cell. Each of these cells has this rendered result, and it also has some code in it, right? So this is actually a block of markdown code that renders this text. So if I add a bunch of exclamation points because I'm really, really excited about this talk, it shows up there and tells me that I should reshare it. So besides markdown, you can put other stuff in here. So you can have like HTML code in here, even things you shouldn't use, like a marquee tag. And you can always see the code behind the cell by clicking on the left side here, right? So here, 2 is 1 plus 1. Shocking, right? And this is actual JavaScript, right? So if I make it 10 and update it, it updates the thing. Or like if I make it a string of 10, because this is JavaScript, it makes it 110. So, in addition to that, you can give a name to these cells. So here we have a cell that defines this value size as 20. And then here we have this little block of HTML that defines a little div with the word hello in it and sets the size, the font size to be equal to that value. So simple enough, right? But what makes Observable a little special is that cells are reactive. So what that means is that when I change a value that's used in another cell, it's going to rerun the cell that has dependencies. So in this case, if I change this to like 120 and rerun it, then the hello gets really big, right? So this is like a cool little property of things. Like what's actually happening here, right, is like this is actually secretly registering a listener so that every time the size changes, it'll rerun it. This makes it really easy to kind of combine these cells in ways that make sense. And unlike something like Python notebook or R notebooks, where you can rerun the cells out of order and so on, this always runs in dependency order. So you're guaranteed to see the same results, which is a handy property. So all of this is built on the asynchronous constructs that are wonderful in JavaScript, so promises and generators and so on. So you can await values in these cells. You can return a promise, which will be automatically unwrapped when it's used in another cell. And you can define cells as generators, which means they can yield multiple values. I'm sure most of that did not make any sense to most of you because it didn't make any sense to me when I first read about it. But basically the gist of this is that you can use this to build up UI components that then expose a value in addition to their view. So here, I'm bringing in this color picker. This is imported from another notebook. It's like a standard thing they provide. And you can see this special view of word basically says, show me the color picker, but make the value that it's exposing available as C. And so then we have the same thing here for the slider. And then we have this HTML block that basically uses that color and that slider to set some properties, right? So you can move the square size and changes, and you can change the color, and it changes. So you can start to see how you might be able to build these up into like a more complicated notebook that actually does something useful. And also how this kind of close connection where you can just take some value that you're using and pull it into a UI component that you can twiddle with makes it really easy to do that kind of refining iterative loop that I was talking about before. So like I mentioned briefly, these are imported from another notebook. Every cell that's named is automatically exported, so you can then import it into whatever other notebook you use. So here, this is like a chart from another notebook that I made, and you can see it's like imported here. This is the ugly name because I haven't made it public. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up this other notebook that this came from. So this is an example of doing some exploratory data analysis in a notebook. So in this case, I'm not even starting with a data set. I'm actually doing the data scraping all in this notebook. So NOAA, the weather folks, have this great thing where they've been tracking the monthly precipitation data in downtown Los Angeles since July of 1877. And there's some missing data in here, but this is just like an HTML table that has lots of numbers in it, right? So say I want to make some visualization about LA rainfall and I want to use this. I actually can just get the HTML right into the notebook by this is just using D3 is a convenient way to fetch the file, but you could do this with another library. Now we have this HTML object, and I can actually pull the data out of it, right? So here, I'm just saying, like, for each row in the HTML, I'm going to map that to this data object where I'm like pulling the year out of the right cell and grabbing all the month totals and so on. And you can see as a result, I get this data object. So when you have something that's not HTML or Markdown, you have a value, then Observable will print this nice little inspector thing that you can use to investigate it. So I made a couple little other versions of the data that have slight variations. Like, so this first one has one object per year, and this one has one object per month. And these are just some conveniences that I made to make that easier. But so now that we have this data in this notebook, we can do what I was saying before, which is like do some exploring of it. So I'm using a library here called JS.LA, which I have very little experience with. But the idea here is you want to be able to generate a lot of graphs really quickly. So tools like matplotlib in Python and ggplot in R make this really easy. This has been something that JavaScript historically has not had awesome solutions for, but they're starting to. So Vega Lite is a library that allows you to, similarly to the ones I just mentioned, you give it some data and you tell it, like, I want a bar chart and I want the X to be based on this and that, and it will generate all the scales for you and do a lot of the kind of like grunt work for you. So this chart here just takes that data, says, I want a bar, like I want the X to be the year and the Y to be the year total, and then show me the chart. So there's like very little configuration to make a chart, right? And we can do lots of other ones. So like, let's say, I notice there's some missing data in the data, right? So I have a chart that has the missing months instead of the totals, right? And so I can see, oh, well, got missing data in the current year, right? Because we're not done with it yet. But basically since like, was it 1941 they had one missing, but since 1942, we've had really good data. So maybe it's like, I'll just focus on the 1942 and later stuff, right? Because unless you're like an aficionado of 19th century rainfall. Then similarly, you can, so in that case, I have all that data that I mentioned earlier. It's actually hooked up to this slider so that this slider will run a filter to remove the earlier years that are before the value here. So you can see, like, because all these are hooked up to the same thing, when I change the minimum year, it's actually going to update all the graphs at once. So we can say, like, let's just look at 1950, because that's an even place to start. And now it's a little easier to see things too. So maybe my hypothesis coming in here was like, oh, it feels like it's been raining a lot lately, as I'm sure you've all noticed. I think it's been like the wettest it's been in quite a while, right? So let's find out if that's true. So in that process, I might like come up with some different ways of looking at that data. Like here, like these are the same year totals but colored by month, so you can kind of get this weird view of like, does most of the rain come at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year? Maybe it doesn't really make sense to look at it this way, but it's kind of interesting to see, like, some years have almost none at all, some have tons but only in one part of the year. This is all with JS.LA, just doing the same kind of things, right? So here we have like the same idea, but instead it's using a rect instead of a bar, gives you this heat map type thing. This starts to show something, right? It's like, okay, we can see like, there is something here, but it turns out like maybe there's not actually that much compared to 2 years ago. Last year was dry, before that we had a whole bunch of dry. But you know, there's like, in the course of history, it's not like it's been all that wet this year actually, which is shocking to me. And then maybe let's try one more where this time we're actually, so JS.LA can do all kinds of things automatically. So here I'm saying like bin the years, and then for each of the squares you're showing, use the mean value of what you have in there. And here I think this actually shows a little more clearly that basically between 1990 and 2000 it was really rainy. It's really just in the last 10 years we had an unusually dry compared to the previous values there. Similarly, I have this final chart here where basically each one of these points represents the last 6 months of rainfall here. So basically it's just like summing up a rolling window here. And you can see like this is where we're at right now, right? And we're actually lower than we were 2 years ago at this time. I'd note that I was really surprised by this, so I double checked it. And this actually depends on the weather station you look at, but we're pretty close. This downtown LA one does show that. Okay, so that's observable and how you can use it for some kind of exploratory analysis. So it's pretty awesome. It's got this reactive runtime, right? It makes it really easy to do these iterative changes, see the results really quickly, and kind of like play with your code in a way that can be kind of fun. It's all in the browser, so this has some downsides, which I'll get to in a minute, but mostly I find this to be a huge positive in that you could go to the library and use this thing, right? You can do this on your phone, although the editing experience not so great, but you actually like view these notebooks on your phone and they're pretty okay. And there's also a really great community. So I mentioned some of the core team members, but besides that, I think because of the Mike Bostock D3 Association, there's a lot of data visualization folks on there, a lot of data journalists, like people from the Washington Post and the LA Times are active on there. There was a visualization that recently ran in the New York Times that was actually prototyped on Observable in like a public notebook by the journalist. So there's lots of cool things. Also, like you guys may have seen, there's a video that went pretty viral recently of like an animated bar chart race of like the largest cities over time. That was actually originally an Observable Notebook also. Now so there's these community features to Observable, so you can like fork notebooks and things like that. And there are now, like 100+ forks of that bar chart race notebook. And you could make one too. So because of that, it's really awesome for prototyping. Because of all these reactive features, it's like very fast and it's very shareable. But there are some things that are less awesome about Observable. So debugging is a little weird. It's not so bad if you keep your cells small, which is probably good practice for whatever you're doing. But because you're not running script files and it's all running through this runtime, it just is a little quirky, and everything runs in like a VM, so it's kind of strange. But it's not a huge hurdle, but just something to be aware of. You're also, because it's in a browser, the downside is you miss out on some of the IDE niceties that you might be used to. So like, there's some rudimentary autocomplete, but it's not as good as what you're going to get in your like local TypeScript project or whatever. You're probably missing out on like your favorite refactoring shortcuts and multiple cursors and stuff like that. It also doesn't exactly scale to like a really complex app, right? Like, it's hard to imagine how you would build something on top of that did like routing. Or if you have like multi-layered components, like you probably don't want to be like spreading those across multiple notebooks, but then keeping them in one notebook is hard, and so on and so forth. So basically, don't use it for complex apps. But it's good for lots of other things. The final point that I want to touch on is publishing it off the site. So Observable does give, their runtime library is open sourced and is permissively licensed. So you can pretty easily embed a notebook on your own website. But it's not seamless, and you have to write some more glue code to do it. So I wrote this tiny little library that I call Observable Press, which is an opinionated pattern for publishing observable notebooks. And it's available on GitHub at this page. All the demos I'm about to show are also linked on that page. And I'll have a link to it later too. So the core idea is that you want dead simple defaults. So the first reason this came up for me was I made this thing like this, right? It's just like an animation of some colors. This is actually like one of the most popular parts of observables. Like people make like all kinds of weird little like generative art things. This is not a particularly good one, I hate to say. So I wanted to host this on my own page, and I didn't necessarily want to share this with people and have them like see all this stuff around here, or like have to think about like, oh, am I supposed to be like logging into this colorful animation? So with Observable Press, you can, with 8 lines of HTML, make this. So the way that works is like so. So this is the whole HTML file for that example. So you got your doc type and opening and closing tags. You got a style sheet. You don't really strictly need this, but if you want things to be full screen, you kind of do, because by default you'll have some margins and stuff. You bring in the Observable Press script. So this is, again, on that GitHub page. This bundles the observable runtime in it. And that script will read these properties, and it'll look for this data notebook attribute. This is the address of that animation that I showed. So you just plug it in. Because there's no cell specified on this file here, it's just going to look for the first cell that comes back with something that looks like content, and it's going to shove it into the body. Finally, I have this last little thing, data override height. So by default, that animation had a height set on it. But in the case of like a full screen animation, you might want not the original height. So this will basically just look for a variable called height in the original notebook and delete it if it exists. And then it'll allow the height instead to read the height of the browser window. Okay, so that's great, but kind of simplistic, right? Like the reality is most things, even observable notebooks, are probably going to be more complicated than that. Probably, you want like that UI component so that people can twiddle with the little knobs. So, second example here. I made this thing that I call the Pantry Nutrition Explorer. So this is a D3 chart based on some data that the USDA makes available. It has about 7,800 foods in it, and it has all kinds of nutritional information about the foods. So I should note also, if you see something weird here, keep this in mind. All the values are shown per 100 grams of food. So like if the serving size is really small, you can get some weird stuff. But we got like a filter, so you can type in and narrow down what's there. And we have this chart here where you can see some various things. So in this case, I just have some of the food groups selected. You can change what's on the X and Y axis, et cetera. So just like a couple interesting things here. The orange is beef products here. And you can see how there's like 2 stripes here. And that's because the bottom stripe, so this is protein on the Y axis, right? And the bottom stripe is all the raw meat. And what happens, obviously, when you cook meat, right, some of the fat cooks off, but it also makes the protein more digestible. So I thought it was actually kind of interesting how clearly delineated those 2 groups are. And you can go in and like inspect what these things are by doing that. Or like one other thing that I think is kind of interesting. There's like a million interesting things to find in this, so I won't go too far here. But so if we look at just like dairy and egg products and maybe just look at cheese, and then we change this to be like, let's see like glutamic acid content. So glutamic acid is what's in like MSG or mushrooms, and it's associated with like savory flavors. So if we look at just like the cheeses by glutamic acid content, you can kind of see like, oh, like the savory cheeses show up on the right. We got like Parmesan over here, goat cheese in the middle, and like cream cheese down at the bottom. So there's like a million interesting things to find out about your weird food. There's also like, I'll just mention like Denny's and KFC nutrition information in here, all kinds of weird stuff. Okay, but this is great, right? But this isn't exactly what I want to share to other people because it has like all this other stuff, right? And it's like if you're not a programmer and I'm just trying to show like my friend this, or I'm trying to show like, if I'm making this as a project for someone, then they don't necessarily want all this to be there. So with Observable Press, I made this tailored view for it where it's just exactly what you want it to be, custom styling, it has these controls arranged in a more logical way. So how does this work with Observable Press? Well, it's not much more complicated. It adds a few more lines of HTML, a bunch of CSS. I'm not going to show you the CSS. But the key is this idea of a data cell attribute, right? So any div or element you put into your page that has a data cell attribute, it's going to look for that named cell in the notebook that you passed to the data notebook attribute. And if it exists, it's going to shove it into that div. So in this case, the main chart is called chart, and it looks like that. And then the UI part of it is just this. So here, you can see we have these one data cell for each of the 4 UI components, the filter, the X and Y controls, and the food group selector. And then those are just wrapped in this really simple HTML. There's a UI class that gives it some basic styling, and then a row to give it that cross-axis. Finally, you might have noticed that there was, before the nutrition thing actually loaded, there was a brief loading indicator there. So this thing has about 1 megabyte of data in it because it does have, like I said, 8,000 foods. If you're waiting for that to load on the observable page, you just see like a blank space and like a gray bar on the side saying like this is pending essentially. So I decided to kind of address that most common use case with Observable Press. So basically anything you put with the class loading on it is going to get removed once all of the cells that you're waiting for have fulfilled at least once. So this lets you have basically initial loading indicator, again, without really writing anything other than HTML. Okay, so to wrap up, Observable Press. Simple defaults make it really easy to share your basic stuff. Have this declarative structure where you specify it just in HTML, which makes it so that you can code only in the notebook. This also means so in the last week, I've made some little tweaks and changes and polish to that Nutrition Explorer, and I didn't have to change the demo code at all, right? It just loaded the new notebook. You can specify a version number, which you probably should if you're doing something like in a more professional context, let's say. But if you just say get the latest version, it's going to get whatever you published most recently. And finally, give you some handy utilities, right? So the height thing that I mentioned earlier, the loading indicators, all things that you would have to write a tiny bit of glue code yourself. But instead of writing it one off for each time you want to share your observable project, I wrote it once, and hopefully you can all use it. So again, that's the GitHub page. So that's what I got for you. If you want to see more of the other stuff that I've been working on, that's my website. If you or your company or people you know have some interesting data problem that you want help with, send me an email. I'm always interested in talking about that. And finally, the ZZEV is my handle on Twitter and Reddit and so forth, where I post all this stuff, especially Twitter, Reddit here and there. And then finally, these slides are at that website. I got the lowercase version too, just in case. But there's links to all this stuff in there, so if you're curious about it, that's where to go. I'm not sure if we actually have time for questions, but if we do, I'd love to hear them. No, sorry, no questions. I'll come to the drinks to ask that if you want to hear it.